Bye bye Britannia, that's a way to start this video. On January 31st this year, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland really got serious and left the EU. Since then, the British have formally no longer been members of the European Union and have left political institutions. In everyday life, however, little has changed for people and the economy thanks to the transition phase. But now the relationship between the island and the continent needs to be put on a new footing. This has to happen by the end of the year, otherwise there's another no deal. Not least because of the corona pandemic, which has killed more people in Great Britain than in any other country in Europe, the time window for a new agreement is getting even closer. How is Britain realigning its compass for the Brexit era? Great Britain is racing into a double crisis. Not a double natural disaster, but a man-made mega crisis triggered by the failure of British politics to face two different challenges. The corona crisis has hit no other country in Europe as hard as Great Britain and has triggered crisis number one. Nowhere else in Europe have so many people died of COVID-19 as in the United Kingdom. And at the same time, the latest forecasts predict that no other economy among the large industrialized nations will collapse this year as strongly as the British. At the beginning of next year, the hard Brexit will likely come in and the already downturned economy will plunge into the abyss. Crisis number two. Rational politicians would probably try to stop the crash at this point. For example, by extending the transition period and thereby keeping the country in the European single market for a further 1 or 2 years, to gain time for a sensible deal with the EU. Time that currently doesn't exist in either London or Brussels, because politicians on both sides of the English Channel have their hands full dealing with crisis number one, the corona pandemic. But reason left British politics some time ago. The ideology has entered Westminster, now paired with collective incompetence. A lot was expected from the outside, but not with this fatal mixture of ideology and incompetence. It was known, of course, that the English occasionally have a whim, that the proportion of eccentric on the island is certainly greater than on the continent, that they are sometimes quite strange people, which is why they are endearing. But the bottom line had always been that the British were pretty cool computers and rational minds. An impression, incidentally, shared by Heinrich Heine, who once wrote, "If you talk about politics with the stupidest Englishman, he will always know something reasonable to say." Heinrich Heine did not know Boris Johnson and his Brexiteers at that time, otherwise he would have revised his judgment or at least put it into perspective. Nobody could have imagined in 2013 that the British would vote for Brexit 3 years later and leave the EU 7 years later. On the one hand, Great Britain always had a special role in the concert of the European nations, joined the community late and always considered political independence. On the other hand, it was Margaret Thatcher who made the idea of a common internal market appealing to continental Europeans. And with it, the customs and trade barriers in this large European economic area were torn down. It is hard to believe that the British would say goodbye to this great invention of their long-standing head of government, who is still revered by the Conservatives. But it is true. By the way, in 2013, the topic of Europe only played a minor role in the political discourse of Great Britain. Only a small group of EU skeptics in the Conservative House of Commons faction had still not accepted the country's accession 40 years later. In addition, a small but noisy Nigel Farage beat the drum of EU opponents. With this United Kingdom Independence Party, however, he was only able to achieve success in the elections to the European Parliament that were completely insignificant from the British perspective, but not in the elections to the House of Commons in London. The British exit was therefore not inevitable, but rather a historical accident, the result of a perfect storm for the Brexiteers and a miscalculation by the Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron. We remember, Cameron only included the EU referendum in his party's election program in order to calm that part of his party that was skeptical about Europe. And on the safe assumption that this then coalition partner, the Liberal Democrats, would not allow this referendum anyway. But his Tories surprisingly won the absolute majority in the 2015 House of Commons election, and Cameron then had to deliver the referendum he did not like. After all, on the assumption supported by the demonstrations that the citizens would choose to remain in the European Union. However, as is well known, 4 years ago, on June 23, 2016, things turned out differently. Many Britons who felt that they were economically left behind protested with their vote against EU membership against the years of conservative austerity policies. And precisely at the time of the referendum, the so-called refugee crisis on the continent provided images that increased the desire for isolation among the British, especially the English. In addition, the EU-friendly young British failed to vote in a similar number to the more EU-skeptical older citizens. And the result of this ideal mixed situation from a Brexiteer perspective? 52% for leaving the EU. What came after that probably surprised everyone again. After this shock result, there was no collective awakening. The Brexiteers cheered, the Remainers resigned. Useless and endless skirmishes began in the House of Commons, which Cameron's successor Theresa May repeatedly failed, primarily because of her own people, and showed the urgent need for reform of the oldest democracy in the world. The EU-friendly Labour opposition, under its completely overwhelmed and EU-critical chairman Jeremy Corbyn, failed completely. The great spirits of the country, the thinkers and the creative artists, retreated, sulking. EU-friendly demonstrators strolled through central London every few months when the sun was shining, but there was nothing more. No rearing up against the crash into Brexit. Instead, the British showed their stiff upper lip and then made Boris Johnson Prime Minister last year. A big mouth which, up to then, even the own party had not considered a ministrable but a filou. A man of simple messages. Get Brexit done. Pull through Brexit no matter how. Details have never been as much Johnson's thing as big as sayings or small or large swindles. The majority of the British found this fair-haired simple truth just right after May's grueling negotiations with the EU. The Tories, led by Johnson, won the House election in December. They won a majority of 80 seats. The Conservatives had previously only managed that in Thatcher's time. This gave Johnson a clear path at Brexit, and the British left the EU on January 31st. Shortly thereafter, the corona pandemic broke out across the country, showing that Johnson on Downing Street is indeed a misstaff. The Prime Minister still shook hands and declared the pubs an indispensable part of the British way of life when the countries on the European continent were already in the lockdown. Since then, the pandemic has relentlessly exposed the weakness of the Johnson government. A cabinet of preachers and inexperienced ministers whose qualifications for their offices primarily consist in being in favor of Brexit. A Prime Minister who promises great things and keeps next to nothing. Controlled by a sinister advisor who despises the parliamentary system, the civil service and the free press, but has a great talent for simple messages. Take back control. With this slogan, this Dominic Cummings won the EU referendum. And with Get Brexit Done, Johnson won the House. With big sayings and small deeds, however, no pandemic can be defeated. The British came too late for everything. Lockdown, testing, buying protective clothing, protecting people in old people's homes and nursing homes. The result? The highest number of corona deaths in Europe. Even the Prime Minister and his advisor became infected, and Johnson even had to spend a few days in intensive care. The pity effect only helped him temporarily. Since it became known that corona-infected advisor Cummings travelled hundreds of kilometers across the country instead of following the government's instructions to stay at home, the majority of the British have lost confidence in this Prime Minister. That Johnson Cummings did not fine after this blatant misconduct does not even understand his own party friends. There is only one plausible explanation for this. Johnson cannot do without Cummings. He depends on his advisor. It is quite possible that it is now also Cummings who is pushing to pull through the Brexit at the end of the year and not to extend the transition phase. Then the Brexiteers could say that the economic crash is solely due to corona and has nothing to do with the isolation from the European Union and its internal market. It sounds cynical, but with this government, it is quite possible. However, the country seems to be slowly waking up. Johnson has a much more powerful opponent in the new Labour leader and opposition leader Sir Keir Starmer than the fickle Jeremy Corbyn. The Welsh and Scots try to stand in the way of the madness caused by the English. And from the ranks of the Tories and the Tory-related press, Johnson is now receiving significantly more criticism than applause. The Spectator, a conservative weekly, writes succinctly that Johnson is not suitable for Downing Street. A former Tory MP declares the Prime Minister to be a superficial opportunist with moderate entertainment talent in the Times. Many now remember the Conservative Prime Minister John Major, who lost control and power after the pound-sterling crash and eventually had to make room for Labour politician Tony Blair. Will Brexit be mixed with Corona? Johnson's major moment? Possible. But for now, Britain will probably become Europe's sick man. Not as a result of an inevitable infection, but because of human error. And if you now want to know more about European politics from a German point of view, I'll put my next video right here in the end screen. Click and enjoy. I'll see you there. Viel Spaß!